Good afternoon. My name is Merle Massey, and I'm the coordinator for undergraduate research here at the University of Saskatchewan. Welcome to our session today, which is on the Researcher Skill Development Framework. And it's an invitation to take a look at this particular framework and to think about where you might fit within this framework and where you think your skill sets currently lie. And with that, we will start the presentation. So as always, as we gather here today, we acknowledge that the University of Saskatchewan sits on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. So most of you know that I'm a historian, so that's where we're going to start, but I'm going to just give an outline. When we're done today, these are the three things that I want you to be able to do. Number one, I want you to be able to recognize the research skill development framework. So if you see it in other contexts or you see variations of it, because there are multiple variations, that you'll recognize it. It's often used to create rubrics, and so you're really going to see it there. So if you pull apart a rubric in one of your classes, you might find aspects of the research skill development framework in there. The second thing is I do want you to be able to use this framework so that you can pull apart those syllabi and see where your coursework and your classwork might fall in terms of what you're being asked to do in the classroom. So that's another thing that the RSD is very useful for. And the third is to start to recognize where your skills fall, where you're comfortable, and where you'd like to build, where you want to start to look towards where you are not comfortable, because of course being uncomfortable is where you learn and where you grow. So I'm a historian, so here's the context. So the research development framework actually came out of Australia. The main researcher who works on this, his name is John Willison, and we've actually had him visit at the University of Saskatchewan. He came here in, I believe, 2018. And visited here. One of the reasons for it is that Australia has done a nationwide push to make sure that university students at the undergraduate level are exposed to research. And so there's a lot of researchers who took a deep dive into this and really started to work out what that looked like and what research skills actually are. So really to kind of delineate what research skills they're talking about. So they talked to researchers, and researchers kind of broke down their skills. And then this has also become a very, very huge, it's one of the top 10 models used around the world. Faculty and professors who are teaching classes will actually embed research right into the course. And they do this for a lot of different reasons. Number one, it's a really good way to learn the content. You actually take a deep dive into the content. And number two, it's because students and professors can learn together. So they can actually be in a classroom and conduct research within the classroom that can be, if they wish it to be, actually publishable. And so the model is about engaged learning and engaged teaching, where the students and the professors are all learning together. So that's part of kind of that background of where it comes from. And the University of Adelaide, I'm just going to stop this share for a moment and end the show for just a moment, and then I'm going to share the actual site. So this comes from the University of Adelaide, and this is their models of engaged learning and teaching. And so the thing about the research skill development framework that I just wanted to make sure that you guys knew and understood is that it's something that's been iterated a lot, which means that they kind of started in one particular place and they've worked on it a lot through the years, and they've changed and they've added and they've gone into different ways. And so we're going to talk about a few of the different iterations that the research skill development framework has come up with, because it's highly applicable in both workplace situations and in university situations. It's mostly used in universities, but it has different applicabilities and different usefulness. So I just wanted to show you this, the University of Adelaide website. And so if you're looking for it, it's under the models of MELT, models of engaged learning and teaching. You can see here on the left, research skill development and research skill development for masters. So the research skill development framework, there's a whole bunch of them. There's simple ones, there's intermediate ones, there's detailed ones. We're going to take a look at the detailed one today. So I'm going to stop this share again, and I'm going to go back into my PowerPoint and start that and reshare. Angie, if you could just give me a heads up and make sure that I'm back where I need to be. Sorry to pick on you. Anybody can, just give me a hand wave.
Yes, you're good.
Oh, good. Thanks, Ange. Okay, so this very detailed, I don't expect you to read this screen, is the researcher skill development framework. And this is the fully developed research skill development framework. I'm going to break it down throughout the presentation, and we're going to look at different aspects of it. But I wanted to show you that it's all on one page. And actually, and for those of you who can see me, I actually have a laminated copy of it. And I have both the original 5-scale version and the new 7-scale version, so the big long version. This laminated, I have a whole box full of them in my office at the university, and I hand them out to professors quite a lot because they use them when they're developing, in particular, FIRE classes, so first-year research experience classes. And so I use this quite a lot. I also used it as I was developing and setting out the SURE program and thinking through the sort of areas that we wanted to make sure that we were implementing as part of the SURE program. So I have used it in both contexts. So with that, I'm going to take this big one off your screen and we're going to focus in on a few things. So on the left-hand side, so first we're going to start here. So this white stuff on the left, they call it the facets of research. And they've developed them into 6. And so when a researcher is first starting a project, that's really about embarking and clarifying, kind of deciding what you're going to look at and how you're going to initiate this particular research project. And always heeding ethical, cultural, social, and team considerations. So they in this framework, they call that ECST, but still we do that as well at the University of Saskatchewan. You have to, if you're going to start a research project, let's imagine that you're in a lab. You have to set up a research project that actually fits the skill sets of the team in the lab, that fits the equipment that's in the lab, that fits the funding ability that the lab has available to bring in particular materials for your particular research project. You have to make sure if you're working with humans or animals that you're considering ethical sorts of things. If you're doing a research project that's out in a community, for example, then you need to make sure that you're paying attention to cultural and social sorts of things. So that's where you're embarking on your research question. The next step, of course, is to find and generate. So once you figured out what you want to research, you dive in and you get started. So you're starting to find and generate the information using the appropriate methodology for the class. The third, of course, is to evaluate and reflect. And the reason why we put this here instead of towards the end, people might think that that's part of analyze, but what it is that when you're embarking on a research project, you pretty quickly start to evaluate and reflect, like, yeah, no, that piece of information or that piece of literature review doesn't actually fit what I'm doing. This belongs, this might, I'll take a closer look at it. No, that's totally not where I'm going. And so you make these sorts of judgments and you discern as you're going along. The fourth step is to organize and manage. So basically, as you're building your data set or as you're conducting your research, and whether it's a literature search or whatever it is, you're keeping it organized, you're managing what you've got, you're staying on top of your data, you're starting to look at it and you're starting to reveal the patterns and the themes. You're also managing, if you're part of a larger research team, you're managing the teams and the research processes. So that's the organizing and manage phase. Analyze and synthesize, that's when you're doing that deep dive. It's like, okay, I think I've got what I need. I'm really going to dive in. I'm going to have the data talk to me, whether you're in an archive, wherever you are, and you're starting to really engage with that data and listen to it and synthesize it and analyze it, because you're working to produce some kind of coherent new understanding, some new knowledge that didn't exist before. And the last stage is communicate and apply. So that's when you're writing it out, you're discussing it with your lab mates, you're taking it to conferences, you're discussing the applications and the implications of the research. Maybe you're writing it up for a journal, you're engaging in peer review, so then that's feedback and to make sure that it's better. And of course, still all within those ethical, cultural, social, and team issues. Now, on the next slide, you'll see that there's some words here on the side, and that's where we're going next. These are important because each of these kind of gives us a verb that talks about what we're doing in each of these stages. So when you're embarking and clarifying, coming up with a research question or a project, you're curious. That's where your curiosity comes to the fore. The next is determined. That's when you're like, okay, I got to find what I need, or I'm going to create my research project. I'm going to lay out how I'm going to do it. and how I'm going to construct it. Then you discern, you start to evaluate and reflect like, no, that's not going to quite get me where I want to go. I need to go in this direction. So you're starting to make those choices. Then you're organizing and you're managing. So you're staying on top of all of that you've got. So that's harmonizing. That's what we call that, is making sure that you're bringing harmony to what you're doing. Then you've got that analysis and synthesis, and that's very much a creative process, which is interesting because usually in sciences, we think of analysis and synthesis as very dry and objective process and not so much creative, but it is inherently a creative process, very creative process, because you're bringing yourself to your research project. You might see something totally different than what another researcher might see looking at the same data. And so that's where your creative skills come into play. And the last, of course, is constructive, because if you do research in a secret lab that no one else ever gets to see, or I write a book that no one else ever gets to read, you're not doing anything that actually builds the discipline or engages with anyone else or teaches anyone else. So it's kind of not very useful. So that's where you're being constructive, and you're being constructive into that wider world. Maybe you're being constructive just to the people in your class and kind of showing them what you've learned so they learn and engage, or maybe you're reaching out right across your department or your discipline or your lab or right across the world. So, you know, these are kind of some different levels and steps. So they put those in there in the research development framework, and you can see that again right on the side. You can see the curious, determined, discerning, harmonizing, creative, and constructive. So I wanted to make sure that I raised those to your attention. All right. Now we're going to take a look at, so that was the left-hand side. Now we're going to take a look across the top. So across the top, and I'm going to go back again just so that you have a chance to look at them, because I have to, just for the sake of slides, I have to generate them. But we're going to take a look at across the top. So the first three are considered supervisor instigated. So this is where a supervisor, usually within a class, and then moving up into, say, maybe a more senior class or an honor, or moving almost into honors. So supervisor instigated. The supervisor or the faculty who's teaching the class, for example, are creating your research project and setting some boundaries. They might be very tight boundaries, so that's prescribed research. They might be a little bit more loose, more of like a sandbox idea where, okay, you have to be in this sandbox, but what you do in there is up to you. Or maybe scaffolded research where they teach you steps, and you have to do this because then you'll progress to the next step, and you'll progress to the next step, and so on and so forth. So those are the three that are supervisor instigated, and then researcher instigated. And I'm going to go back to my slide that shows these a little bit more. So supervisor instigated there, and then researcher instigated. So that means that the student or the researcher actually initiates the project. So self-initiated research level 4, this is where you're at sort of at an honors level. So, and sometimes in a capstone class. So you might be able to say what you want to do, and then, but you still have a supervisor who's guiding and kind of watching and making sure that you don't, veer off. Open research is where researchers kind of determine their own guidelines, making sure, of course, that they're in accord with the discipline. And so you'll see that more in sort of a master's level, but you still have supervisors in place. Or you might have that, let's say a student takes on an individual project. That does happen quite often across campus. And adopted and enlarging research, we generally see more PhDs, postdocs, and faculty in these particular areas, these two purple areas. But I have seen undergraduate students in these areas as well. Sometimes undergraduate students can come up with really, really amazing research projects that will actually inform other people's research and change what they're doing, or actually enlarge the discipline or the field of inquiry, and sometimes actually change a field's entire direction. I've seen that happen. It tends to be, like I said, more postdocs and PhDs and faculty who are doing that, but I have seen it at the master's and the undergraduate level. So that's kind of, it gives you sort of that colored framework. So to take a look at the larger thing. So after that, okay, we're going to take a breath, we're going to rest, and I'm going to wait and see if anyone has any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or pop them into the chat, either one.
So like, if I have a good idea and I approach a professor, so like he'll supervise me, right? That's what you're trying to say.
Yeah,
and he'll make the necessary arrangements so that I can get into good position for that research?
Yeah, oftentimes that's absolutely what's going to happen, Joe. Just so you know, my office has done several other presentations this fall that give you a lot of really good guidance and specifics around really good practices to approach a professor. And so I'll send around those links to everyone via email afterward. But this presentation is a little bit more about your skill set and understanding where you fit on this skill set. So that's what today's presentation is about. But I have given other presentations that give really good guidance for students to make that first connection to a professor. Are you going to talk about how to make a research proposal? Not necessarily, no. Today, our topic is specifically about looking at the research skills development framework. It's a way for you to help you understand where you're at as a student and as a researcher. But we do have some of those, the library has put those sessions together, and I can happily share those examples for you. Okay, we're going to continue. Everybody's had a bit of a break. Keep going. Okay, so I wanted to dive into this a little bit more, simply because, and of course, since the page is so large, you do have to break it up. But let's imagine that you're starting your research project. So that's on the left-hand side in the white. You're embarking, you're clarifying. And let's say that you're in a first-year class. So it might be something very, very prescribed. So the professor has laid out exactly what you need to do within that particular little project. It might be a lab that you complete within 3 hours, something like that. Sometimes if it's a bounded research, so then you might be responding to something that the professor has set up, and but you've got a little bit more leeway and a little bit more choice. Usually in red and level 1, you don't have a lot of choice. You have to stay within a particular framework, or you have to finish within 3 hours, or you have to, or it's like a cookie cutter lab where you have to stir things exactly right and do things exactly right, and you come up with and everybody ends up with the exact same results. Within bounded research and scaffolded research, there's a little bit more room for students to come up with different responses to the question, and that's really what I wanted to kind of touch on here, especially when it comes to things like evaluating and reflecting. So this third one, so discerning, that's one of the key areas that students find a little bit more problematic, simply because it comes down to confidence. And confidence is one of those issues where you will develop it the more research you conduct. So if you do a literature search, or you do a 5 or a 10-page paper in a first-year class, then as you go into other classes, you're going to be able to open that up and do a little bit more and make your own decisions. Your confidence level will grow, and you're going to be able to develop your ability to discern and decide what data is good, what data is not good, what data is actually going to build your particular research question or help you answer your research question, and what has less value. So I wanted to kind of poke in on that one. The library, and I thank Angie for being here. If you are in where you're finding and generating, and you're trying to find which particular information or methodology you need to use, of course, it's usually your professor that tells you which methodology they want. But if you're stuck on information and finding data, that's where the library is really, really important. And they host a number of webinars that help you with that search process and help you to find and generate what you need for your particular research project. So I wanted to kind of flag that as being very important. Okay, so then so as you keep going a little bit further into that research process, you're starting to, or you've got your data, you've kind of, thought about it a bit, you're starting to harmonize it, you're starting to look for the patterns and themes, you're trying to make it make sense, then you're starting to analyze and synthesize. So I wanted to point out here the difference between level 1, level 2, and level 3 when it comes to analyzing and synthesizing. These are really good examples. When you're first in level 1, in just starting out as a researcher, you're asking an emergent question, which means it might just be a question that you don't know the answer to, right? So you're just figuring out how to construct a research question. And that's actually a very difficult skill, and something that all of us continue to work on. And then the next level, once you've like, okay, I'm just gonna learn how to ask a question and then figure out if it's a good question or not. So then once you hit level 2, you're starting to ask relevant questions. So questions that are relevant to your discipline, and then researchable questions. That's actually the kicker. So if you set a research question that the answer is either just a yes or a no, or you can find the answer in a Google search, that's not a very good researchable question. You want to find a researchable question. That's something that my office has also created, and that's how to create a research question. So we have an infographic around that I'm happy to send around. And then level 3, it's about asking really rigorous questions. So questions that maybe have a little bit more meat, maybe have a little more complexity, maybe have a little bit more might get you in trouble, or you're asking ethical questions or questions that are a little bit edgy. And sometimes that's what we mean by rigor. Sometimes it just means that your question might be more complex and not very easy to answer. And so that just shows your development as a researcher. And then of course, communicating and applying. So that's sort of the final stage, and that's so you're creating your PowerPoint presentation, you're writing up your research report, you're creating something for either your TAs or your professor to read, or if you're in a FIRE class or some other kind of class that asks you to share it more broadly, maybe you're developing something that you're going to share in a symposium. So we have the upcoming fall symposium, for example. So this is about and you'll notice in almost all of these, there's a word that's important, especially over here by the time you hit level 3, understanding for a specific audience. So thinking about who your audience is really makes a difference on how you're going to construct your research, right? So again, you've got one thing going on. Your professor may have asked you just to do a 10-page research paper or a project report that's 10 pages and has very specific outlines. Follow those guidelines. That's not the place to experiment. By the time you get into a little bit more upper level or a little bit more complex sorts of research questions, sometimes you have to build more complex communications things, or you might want to split it out and you might want to give that big presentation. But let's say that you also want to break it down and share some of your findings on Twitter or Instagram or social media in general. I've seen students do that to absolute amazing effect, and to get their friends and relatives really interested in what they're learning at university. And I've seen that happen in some pretty amazing ways. It also, the thing about communicating what you've learned is that it forces you to understand what you've done to a much higher level. You have to be able to understand it well enough yourself to be able to explain it to someone else. And so there's different levels of that, and we all learn and get better at that as we go along. So as we move through that matrix, we get better at that. So that's part of what we're looking at today. So again, we're going to rest and reflect. So I've got some questions. Where would some of your thinking about back in any first year class that you're taking, and maybe even if you're a senior student, you might be taking a first year class as an elective right now, but where would some of your first year assignments fall on that RSD 7? That's a question that you can think about, and maybe you can share in the chat. Another question is, can a professor create an assignment that crosses over more than one level or category? Let's say that they are going to allow you more space in one area and like a larger sandbox or more options, but they want you to produce something very, very specific in terms of your communication. So can a professor create an assignment that sort of shifts around between those colors? And the third question that I want you to think about is, where do you feel the most comfortable now? Where are you at right now as a researcher? And if anyone wants to unmute and talk about that, that's 100% fine. I'm also going to watch the chat. Level 2, given a topic but have to create the research question, and that's a good spot to be. So you feel that you've moved beyond level 1. You still like to have some boundaries, but you want to have more space to work within those boundaries and be a bit more creative. That's a super spot to be. Anyone else feel like they have an answer? Where do you feel the most comfortable in terms of your level of learning right now and your abilities as a researcher? No one else wants to level in, and that's okay. But it is one of the ways. So one of the ways that you're going to be able to use this tool. And because I do consider the RSD a tool, this is something that you can use, like I said, to interrogate when the professor gives you your syllabus and you want to, okay, what are they actually asking me to do? Take out the RSD and measure it against them. You're going to be able to plot exactly where that ask is. On the inverse side, another way to use the RSD is that if you're a student who's ready to approach a professor and talk about, maybe entering their lab or, doing a research project with them, take a look at this, figure out in those areas where you feel comfortable and where you feel that your skill sets are now and where you'd like to move to. It might give you some vocabulary to do that and to do that really well. So that's one of the other ways that you can use the RSD-7 framework. Okay, we're going to jump back in and we're going to look at sort of the more higher level, honors level, master's level kinds of looks. So this is where, again, starting right back at the beginning, where the researcher embarks and clarifies, so comes up with a research question. But when you get to self-initiated research, this is where you're really going to see students in capstone classes and honors classes, and for sure at masters. So the student has some kind of an idea, and so you initiate. It's like, I want to do some research in this particular area, and then maybe you've got a supervisor, and certainly if you're an honors or a masters, you do have a supervisor in place, and they're going to provide some guidance on helping you set that question and making sure that you're setting it in such a way that they can actually help you. If they're a cancer researcher, that's fine. That's just fine. Angie has to go, and that's just fine. Another thing to think about when we take a look at this in terms of researcher instigated and moving through and kind of gaining on your research skill levels, is by the time you hit something like this purple or the blue or the purple area, you tend to be a very confident researcher who's quite well established within a particular discipline. Let's say that you're a master's student, you've done a lot of reading, you're kind of know what's going on. By the time you hit the blue and the purple, you tend to start moving more interdisciplinary as well. And so you're starting to look at where other areas of research might help and inform what you do, and you might try and put two things together. There's a professor in engineering, for example, who actually does most of her research in health research. So she's looking at how knees work. She works with MRIs, that kind of thing. And so that's a huge interdisciplinary mash. And she's actually right there in that purple area where she's adopting research and she's enlarging research over in engineering. And she's generating new methodologies that are going to be used very widely, and they're going to make some really interesting changes. So these can be quite substantial. So again, it's about movement through stages and learning as you go and building your skill set as you go. And so that's one of the things that I want to reiterate, is that everybody starts back at that red side of this particular matrix, and not everybody makes it all the way to the purple side. Some of us, sit here in blue and we're happy forever, and that's fine. We are still producing excellent research that might have an impact further on, but certainly does a good job in building our research skill set. So, and the so moving to the bottom right of that larger research skill development framework, so you're organizing, managing, analyzing, synthesizing, communicating, and applying. And again, so if you're heading into something like a master's, this is where you're going to be able to use self or team structures. You're going to get really, really good at managing the processes within the supervisor's parameters, but still you need to stay on top of your data. You're in charge of it, and also you're starting to understand that you're filling knowledge gaps, and so you're taking a look at what's been done, and you're not redoing what somebody else has done. You're doing something new, and so then you want to showcase, I'm filling in this gap in the research, and that's something that's highly valued within the research community. And again, and the last, of course, communicating and applying. So that's the constructive phase, using the right language, the genre, your showing your increased use of innovation. You're maybe moving things from one context to another. You're probing, you're checking things out, and you're starting to make those first changes. And then as you move through the blue and the purple and the dark purple, you might actually end up changing the whole direction of a discipline. And we've seen that happen as well. So that's the research skill development framework in broken down across a few slides, because when I do it on this one, it's just too big. So I can't, it's just, yeah, it ends up too small on your screen and you can't see it. But here's a fun fact for you, and I liked this little monster as we're heading into Halloween this weekend. You can use the RSD-7, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again, to understand your course syllabus and what your professors are looking for in their classes and their course expectations. So it's a very useful tool. I have emailed it to everyone, so you should all have a copy in your email inbox. Thanks, Audrey, for coming. And it's handy that way, because if you can break down a course syllabus, or you can break down, let's say, a rubric that the professor is using to evaluate you, and you can break down that rubric according to the research skill development framework, you're going to be able to jump ahead. It's like, okay, they're asking me to be here, but if I move one more step, what could I do within this particular project? If I move just one step over towards the right, one color over, what would I be doing to kind of raise the level of this particular project? So I'm here to help you find a few ways into your to make your university work really, really sing, and to impress your professors, because there's nothing wrong with that. Okay. When I was researching the RSD, there are some other tools that I thought looked really interesting and might be really, really useful, and I've sent those around as well. So remember this, the whole embark and clarify, that, with the words on the side, curious and harmonizing. Well, this group of engineers took the RSD framework, they pulled it apart, and they put it back together into what they called the optimizing problem solving, the OPS pentagon. And the key with this is that when in doubt, return to the center. So I've actually seen professors who have this, and they've printed it up and they've put it up on their wall, or they have it in a binder, and they'll use it when they're in the middle of a research project, because research is never a straight path, and all of us get stuck when we're doing research. And so having something like this, it's like, okay, so we've got our problem definition, we've kind of set out the specific, again, this comes from engineering, so it's very specific for engineering, problem definition and specification. And then let's say that they're finding and reflecting, gathering information, data, and knowledge, and they get stuck or they get lost, and all of a sudden they have too much data, then they go back to the center, problem definition, and then maybe they can move over here and they can start to generate and evaluate. So they're considering alternative solutions. Is this relevant? Of course, being unbiased, very important for engineers and for all science. And then again, if you get lost, and then pop back to the center, organizing and managing, deciding what information and sources to use, planning how you're going to present your work, organizing your work into graphs and tables, that kind of thing. And again, if they get lost, back to the middle, and make sure that they really understand and keep focusing and refining their problem definition, because as you go along, you always go back to that. Research is not a straight path. It's like this very, very messy drawing circle. Analyzing and synthesizing, that's about being critical and being self-critical of what you've created, what you've done, and what the holes still are. When you're creating your own interpretations and conclusions, it's always a good idea, and this is good across all of your projects, to make sure that you let your professor or anybody who's evaluating your work know that you know its holes. Don't just pretend that your work is amazing. Every work out there has holes. And if you show that you know what your holes are, that's actually going to raise your ability as a researcher, and your professors will reward you for that. So never be afraid to say what the limitations are of your work. And then finally, of course, communicating and applying. So effectively conveying what you're proposing, your opinions, your options, your actions, your results. Engineers or recommendations. Engineers tend to be very goal oriented, very product or outcome oriented. And so it's always about what action are we going to do, or what's the new gadget that's going to solve this particular problem. So again, this comes from an engineering background, but the reason why I wanted to bring it forward is because then the RSD actually went back and they took their RSD framework and they and they put it into a pentagon, exactly the same as what, well, it's not exactly, it's slightly different. They went back to their original lists. But this is something that I have also sent around with everyone. And same thing, when in doubt, return to the center. So what I like about the RSD Pentagon is that they've added in some questions for each of those sections. And I find these questions really, really helpful. So right in the center, always start in the center, what is your purpose? And then you're finding and generating, what do you need? Evaluating and reflecting, what do we trust? So which information do we trust? What actually applies to what I'm doing and what doesn't? What actually not so much supports, be careful with that, because if you're only picking stuff that supports your thesis, then you've got a problem. But what do we trust? Who's done research that we trust? And then how do we arrange it? How are we going to put it together? How are we going to make it harmonize and sing? Analyze and synthesize it. Well, what does it mean? That's the big question to think about. What does it mean? And that's what you're looking for when you're analyzing and synthesizing. And the last one, of course, is communicating and applying. So how is this related? How is what I've learned related to what came before? And how is it related to other things going on in the real world? So I have included the RSD Pentagon. I have it printed up. It's actually on the wall in my office as well. When I'm doing my own work, I actually find it quite useful. And again, that when in doubt, return to the center. So I made sure that it's on all of your emails. So take a look there and you'll be able to find it. Then there's a couple of other things. So out in the real world, are these ideas actually only useful when you're a student, or do they apply in the real world? And that's what I found really, really interesting, is that the RSD has been, so with the basic framework of being goal-oriented. So this is actually the work skill development framework, and it's built along almost the exact same scaffold. And so you've got your work facets around being goal-oriented. What's your goal? What's your job? What's your initiative? What's your project that you've been tasked with? What are you working on? So that's your motivation. And then what do you need? That's the same question. What are the resources that you need to work on this particular project? And then learning and reflecting. How do I improve? How can I get better? Especially when you're a student doing a work skill. And that's what this was particularly developed for. Planning and management, how do I organize? Again, we talked about that before. Then the critical reasoning and problem solving, so that's the creative. How do I put this all together? How do I make this how do I bring meaning to this? And then communicating it, how do I relate? So they've taken those same frameworks and they've applied it into a work skill. And I've sent this around via email to everyone as well. And it can be found on the University of Adelaide site on their RSD under their MELT, of learning and teaching. So if you've lost an email from me, don't worry about it, it's there. But it does help to show where you start, even as a student or as a worker, and how you can develop your skills as a worker out in the real workplace, and what skills a workplace might be looking for. So that's one example of how the RSD framework was used in a workplace example. I also like this one, and I'm sorry, I know you can't read it because it's way too small and it's all white. However, I do recommend that you take a look at it. It's the digital skill development framework. So it uses a lot of the same things around exploring, clarifying, and then all the way down to collaborate and communicate, the same kind of overview as the original research RSD. But what I really like about this one, again, it sets it out the same way, but on the back side of this one, what they did is that they gave examples, and this is specifically within research, digital research, but I'm going to pick one and just go across between prescribed, bounded, scaffolded, open-ended, and unbounded. So if you're going to set a research question and let's say that you're in computer science and you're in a classroom, a prescribed research question is, you were told your purpose is to make a microbit display a heart. You don't feel confident to explore on your own. You don't really understand or wonder why you're doing this activity. You're just doing it. You're just kind of robotic. Bounded, you're required to to program a robot to move around an obstacle using block coding. You're directed to the correct app and you've been given basic instructions, but you feel confident enough to vary them a little bit. You can imagine how this can be used in different tasks. So you're taking those basic skill sets and starting to see where you can apply them in other areas. In a scaffolded one, and this again, these are just examples. You've been asked to create a website using any platform you like. You play with a few web hosting sites that you've used before, and you decide which one is right for the task that you've been given. So that's scaffolded. So you've got certain options, and you can choose which option is right that you think for that particular project. Open-ended, here's an example. You've been asked to do an oral presentation, but you're told you're not allowed to use PowerPoint. So you searched for and tried different technology to see which seemed most suitable for the task. I would recommend in that situation, but that's just me. Anyway, so that's open-ended. Your task is you have to give a presentation and you can't use PowerPoint. So you got to figure out what else you're going to use. And in unbounded, here's the example that they give. You identified some technology that you hadn't encountered before, and there was no one around to ask about it. You thought it looked interesting, so you started to play with it and explore its functions. You considered what purposes this technology might be suitable for, and you compared it to other technologies. So that's basically when a researcher sees something that they find interesting and they just dive in. So the reason why I showed this one to you is because it gives really good, specific, and concrete examples of their digital skills development framework. Sorry, I lost my mouse. Of how they've set up their digital skill development framework, which is a very good framework. But then they gave examples, which I really quite like. And then there's a few more around organizing and managing, communicating, collaborating, and so on and so forth. And so I do recommend those as well. So I just wanted to give that overview of research. Research is a skill, and you can develop it and you can work on it just like any other skill, whether it's high jump or whether it's being good at coding computers or whether it's good at being at math or whether it's good at playing basketball. I don't care what your skill is. Research is also a skill, and you can start and you can build that skill set. So that's where I wanted to end. So after listening to me for all this time, what do you would any of this do you think is interesting, or could this be of use to you? Are there ways that you think maybe this would be of use to you? And you can go ahead and put that in the chat, and I'm going to stop the presentation.